You will learn about what is the risk, and risk as seen throughout the decades, last 3, 4, 5 decades. Key trend change which happened in respect of operation risk, compliance risk, and relevance of market risk. With the advent of new industries like insurance, mutual funds, private equities. Let's begin. The slide shows various newspaper clippings relating to scandals, Lehman, and then other Enron and whatever. These scams, the frequent scandals and scams resulted in the risk as a hot button, and risk management has continued to be the relevant topic, increasing its emphasis. What is risk? Of course, I will not go into deep of it because probably more or less you might be aware. Risk is possible uncertainty, possible harm associated with the situation, or it's actually calculated uncertainty, calculated or expected or potential level of impact due to the uncertainties. In other words, definitely once we say uncertainty, it has probabilities involved with it, along with the impact of the losses which may happen if the probability is 100%. One is low probability. There is some probability between 0 to 100%, and if probability happens, if the event happens, so then certain losses, some harm, some consequences happen. So it's just a function of these two aspects, probability and impact, which results in certain estimation of the probable risk, and which will lead to the building blocks and actual risk management process. To begin with, I mean, of course, risk is actually a source. If we go to a manufacturing company, raw materials are purchased, processed, and finished goods are sold off. Similarly, risk is a source of return. It is like a raw material. When risk is used, this resource is used in certain initiative project, we ultimately get reward as an output, return as an output. Hence, risk is an input while return is a reward is an output. The other aspect is that in any project, it is a package of risk and return. There is no such package in the world which is risk-free and there is only return. When we invest at a particular debenture or instrument, or we carry out a business, or in any other case, it is always a package of risk and return. So it's upon us to deal with such a package and to really calculate as to how much is the risk versus how much is the return. Risk versus uncertainty. Of course, uncertainty is a larger universe where we even don't know what we don't know. Where risk is we know what we don't know. So risk is knowing the uncertainty, is knowing the unknown, while uncertainty is unknowing the unknown. Uncertainty is definitely a larger basket, and risk is a part of that basket. If you see risk management, why important from the promoter stakeholders perspective? One aspect, if you see valuation models, definitely if an entity has a proper risk management system, the owners, shareholders will feel that okay, this entity is less risky, hence risk premium will be lower, and its expected return will also be lower. For example, a risk-free rate is say 6%. Then AAA instrument will have certain 6% plus certain risk premium. AA will have a higher risk premium. Single A will have further higher. Similarly, if an entity is risk managed properly, its credit risk or maybe risk premium, equity risk premium will not be so high, and hence to that extent expected return will be low and valuations will go up. Hence, a valuation of a better governed company, a company which is a better governance, will always be higher because risk premium expectation will be lower in that case, while valuation of a company which has a low governance or a sort of a family-owned business or a low governance company will always be low because risk premium associated with that will always be higher, and hence risk management, because it helps in reducing the risk premium, it helps in increasing the valuation thereof. Companies operate now with increasing complexity, competitiveness, and with the global markets exposures as well. Hence, risk management across geographies, products, asset classes, across customer segmentations, and across functions has added relevance and importance. Convergence, consolidation, globalization, and unexpected events, of course, added to the challenges. Risk management is basically, in a nutshell, basically into taking calculated risk. You have to take a okay, you take risk, but calculated risk. Take that much risk which is known that okay, we are taking this much of risk, accordingly expecting return. Coming to the how which the concept and the trend of risk management changed during later parts of 20th century, especially the last quarter of 20th century, 80s, late 80s and 90s. Risk management was more focused towards banks' leverage ratio. Leverage ratio, basically capital adequacy ratio. In a layman term, basically, if you see capital adequacy, or it's a limitation on limits on the leverage ratio. Against 100 rupee capital, how much can a bank borrow? Whether 700 or 800 or 1000 or 3000. So that's what is the capital adequacy ratio. So capital adequacy ratio for banks was prescribed at 8%. It means if capital is rupees 800, the risk-weighted assets could not exceed 10,000. Or if, in the other words, if the risk-weighted assets is 10,000, banks were supposed to have minimum 800 capital. Later on, it is increased to 9%. For NBFCs, in fact, it has been 15% for primary dealers. As well, it was 15%. Tier 1, Tier 2 parts are there for the capital. Tier 1 was supposed to be 7.5%, which is going to increase to 10% within this 15% slab. So the basically trend and focus area was on capital adequacy ratio of banks and primary dealers during 80s and 90s. Somewhere in the last decade of 90s, in 95 approximately, JP Morgan came up with the concept of 415 report. What happened that okay, JP Morgan was a dealer in the securities market, equities and fixed income and currencies, bonds, and every day there were market fluctuations. Now, various internal reports were generated by various departments for the head of the business, this chief executive officer. So by the end of each day, the chief executive officer's table was piled up with lots of documents and internal MIS, which was giving no clue to the chief executive officer as to where my organization is going. Ultimately, what the CEO told to his functional team that I just want a one single pager report at 4:15 p.m. every day after the markets close. That report should show one single number, which will basically be interpreted as the loss number which I am carrying to my portfolio. If that single number is rupees X million, it means from today evening to tomorrow evening, I may incur a loss maximum to rupees X million, maximum to X million dollars, and I want this X million to be within my tolerance level. Their functional team worked a lot as to what numbers they should work out, what single number can give the best idea of the probable loss the JP Morgan is carrying overnight to the next day. And somewhere after doing various algos and statistics, they came up with a concept of value at risk, daily earnings at risk, which was based on the PVPP, price value per basis point. Daily, it is more focused on the market risk. If you go back to the previous slide, where the focus was more on the credit risk of the lending banks. In the late 90s, the focus also included the market risk because most of the banks carried SLR and non-SLR portfolios, and the investment bankers had a huge fixed income portfolio especially. So definitely those treasury heads or the business heads wanted to know that how much risk I'm carrying from today to tomorrow, and I should have enough capital to cover up that loss. Hence, capital adequacy ratio started including one more aspect, which is the value at risk. Daily earnings at risk (DEAR) is a number which corresponds to the maximum loss I am carrying over a given period of time. Over one day, value at risk is the same loss which I may incur over a given period of time, maybe 5 days, 6 days, like that. So this is the single number which started being presented to JP Morgan, and over the time our Basel norms as well as banks, Reserve Bank of India also prescribed that we should use these value at risk and DEAR numbers, and capital adequacy ratio should be added with this number also to take care of the market risk on my treasury portfolio. Then in 90s also see the scandals like this Nick Leeson Barings collapse in 1995, which gave a learning as to that we should not go for unknown derivatives trades. In fact, in this case, Barings, the company, the concerned treasury dealer, Nick Leeson, was given authority to do any derivative transactions by making complex derivative products, derivatives of derivatives in short, long calls and options and all these. And for those each transactions, he was taking board approvals. Of course, he was taking board approvals, but unfortunately, even board was not aware as to what risk this trader is taking, and they were just approving these deals. Over the time, losses mounted, and Nick Leeson was unable to report the losses to the board, and board kept on approving those deals, and ultimately the situation came where the entity was no more than it was just a bankrupt. The main learning from this is that okay, the board, as a board member or as a trader, we should enter into only those derivative transactions where we know what risk we are taking. Taking an unknown risk, unknown derivative risk, is something which may lead to the collapse of the bank. The next is the long-term capital management. It was a hedge fund, another case which collapsed, almost near collapse. It did not collapse, but almost near the collapse in 1998 due to over leveraging position. They had a bank, their trading book, which was of 31 times of their net worth. So plus they were taking uncontrolled liquidity risk by having a lot of asset liability mismanagement, and later on it came out as a learning that okay, liquidity risk is of course one of the input, even though it's a short-term liquidity issue, but it can be one of the factors for the collapse of an undertaking. In India, Harshad Mehta case, 1992. Here, in fact, he borrowed funds from the banks, pretending it to be used for investing in bonds and various backward industries and areas and all. The banks were not equipped, were not monitoring the final use of those cash flows, and those cash flows went unchecked. Its usage went unchecked, where he was actually using those cash flows to have a bull run on the equities, on the stock market. The stock market ran up like anything and then collapsed. It created a lot of payment situations, payment problems. Many brokers also went bankrupt, and that was the time when the equities market in India, stock market in India, was closed for months long. in December, January 92. These were the learnings during 90s, which further created building block or the foundations for increased initiative by the RBI and through Basel norms and even SEBI and National Stock Exchange. In fact, SEBI came up in 1992 through SEBI Act, and National Stock Exchange came as an online trading platform in 1993. The advent of SEBI and National Stock Exchange. This was definitely through the various experience the stock market had during 80s and 90s, and if you see the situation during 90s when there were physical trades, physical deliveries were happening, long paying payout schedules, there were huge risks of the settlement. When settlement failures were happening, paying payouts were getting merged together to create a net positions. So these irregularities led to the various payment crises as well as the markets. Plus, being physical securities, there were many instances of signature, poor signature mismatches, and bad deliveries, which led to complete inefficiencies in the equities market. Many of these problems were done away with the online trading platform of National Stock Exchange, which had a new concept of circuit filters introduced during those days, which to protect the collapse of the market in a big way, to act as a breaker in case of sharp fluctuations. Dematerialized system came up with the enactment of the Dematerialization Act in 1996, which led to the compulsory conversion of physical securities in dematerialized form, and knocked off all the problems relating to physical securities. Online margin tweaking, margin corrections, and stopping the terminals, all that becomes very easy. During late 2000, early 2000, late 90s, the settlement period was reduced from 1 week to 1 day. Daily rolling settlement came up. Derivatives in equities and debt fixed income were introduced in fixed income, like interest rate swaps, FRAs, when equities, options, and futures were introduced. And this led to the further increase and impetus for the risk management system, software, training, and risk management, settlement risk management process. Insurance was privatized in 2000, early 2000, and various private insurance companies came in. At the same time, mutual fund industry also flourished during late 90s, early mid 90s, with the advent of various private sector mutual funds. Especially when the privatization happened, in fact, in early 2000 or late 90s, coming back to 90s stage, in mutual fund industry, we had seen the situations of Unit Trust of India's portfolio management system, which has various irregularities about the cutoff dates, cutoff timings, and on the insurance industries, selling were prevalent those days. In 2000, when these industries were flourished in the private sector, IRDA, the insurance regulator, came up with a solvency margin ratio of 1.50 per times. It is again like a capital adequacy ratio for banks. Solvency margin ratio is basically ratio of solvent asset solvency, actual current solvency divided by required solvency with the insurance company. It's in other words, actually having actual assets to take care of the solvency of insurance company divided by expected required solvency based on its actual claim processing or actual claims which came up. So this is supposed to be 1.5. Of course, and nowadays there are talks going on to reduce it to 1.4 or 1.25, or even the insurance industry is optimistic enough to reduce it to 1 as well. SEBI came up with a risk management circular in September 2000. SEBI circular was again, of course, based on the fact that a few private sector mutual funds came up in late 90s, and with the Unit Trust of India's this event happened, which in 2000 or 2001, where the NAV and cut-off time irregularities were there. The SEBI came up with the circular to protect the investors' interest. The circular risk management circular was focused on first disaster recovery and business continuity plan. Second, the insurances of the mutual fund assets, portfolios, and outsourcing investors' databases, as well as third-party insurances like directors and officers insurances. Third, the circular was focused on the internal processes of valuations and the portfolio management, and also fourth, it was specifying the guidelines for portfolio and market risk management for mutual funds. The focus was more on the equitable treatment of investors. The concept of equitable treatment of investors came in around that time, where it was more of like treating all investors at par without any kind of preference to one type of investors individualized to the other type of another category of investors. In early 2000, in fact, in 2000s, of course, Basel norms were also modified. In 2002, norms for operation risks were introduced by Basel and RBI. In fact, the RBI prescribed that okay, there should be some capital requirement for operation risk, and the banks should work out their capital requirement based on their internal assessment, which may be X% of their gross revenue or net interest margin, or even at least to start with maybe 1% of net interest margin or whatever, which was basically it was a starting phase. Later on, the RBI came up with the concept of three approaches: phase-wise advancement of the operational risk management capital adequacy, which was initially saying basic indicator approach, where banks were given the direction that okay, they have capital adequacy ratio of 9% for credit risk as well as market risk. Now they have to work out capital adequacy for operation risk, which will be calculated as say 15% of net interest margin. That was under BIA, basic indicator approach. Later on, Reserve Bank was encouraging banks to move to TSA approach, where it was a standardized approach, where the banks were given flexibility to use different percentage rather than 15%. Banks were allowed to use even 12% of the gross margin for certain departments. That's the department. The idea was to ultimately move to advanced management approach (AMA), where banks will have enough data of past operational risks, operational losses, and based on their own internal historic data, banks can have their own estimates of operational risks involved in the banking business. Liquidity risk management was just introduced post 2008-2009 crisis, Lehman crisis, and the focus of Basel was on two liquidity ratios: net stable funding ratio and liquidity coverage ratio. Net stable funding ratio was more to do with the long-term debt leverages and long-term stability of the bank, while liquidity coverage ratio was more to do with the current and quick ratios, basically to take care of the liquidity requirement over a month's period. And of course, for market risk management, value at risk based guidelines was already there, which was further refined. Post 2007, first was let's see the scandals. Lehman scandal was Lehman's collapse. Lehman's bankruptcy was one of the biggest collapse after the bull run globally from 2003 to 2007. In fact, various entities, investment bankers, just run up on the leverages and increase their asset size, trading books, and took huge leverage positions, which was uncomparable with their net worth and which ultimately lead to collapse of Lehman. Lehman had a balance sheet size of $600 billion, which was the biggest collapse of a banking system at that time. their assets were mainly due to which led to the collapse of Lehman was their subprime assets. Lehman had during 2003-4 during run-up time they had acquired a few businesses which were lending into subprime assets, and those businesses ultimately flourished during up to 2007 and led to the increase in asset size. Ultimately, with the subprime crisis increased, it led to the bubble burst on the asset side, and on liability side, it could not match its lending obligations. It could not pay its lending obligations, and led to the collapse of Lehman in 2008-9. Next comes the let's say this is the Enron. Enron collapse was of course in 2000-2001. In this Enron collapse was again case of misrepresentation to the board, to the shareholders. This is a $70 billion loss which happened to Enron and which went undisclosed to the shareholders, and shareholders continuously infused money to the company, hoping that it is a profitable company. Ultimately, the company could not sustain, and with the misrepresentation to the shareholders, it led to the loss of $70 billion of wealth of shareholders. These scandals, why I'm saying about these scandals, that these are the various scandals and crises which led to the further learnings by the regulators, by the corporates, and by the global systems, financial markets, and added new and new concepts and changed the trends, created new trends for the risk management. This is a case of insider trading post 2007. Raj Rajaratnam and Rajat Gupta. Rajat Gupta was on the board of Goldman Sachs, and in fact, he was connected to Rajaratnam, who was a Sri Lankan hedge fund manager. When after the board meeting of Goldman Sachs, in fact, Rajat Gupta called Rajaratnam that Warren Buffett is about to invest huge chunk in Goldman Sachs, and Rajaratnam traded on the basis of this undisclosed information, which led to the insider trading case. Next is our own this domestic case of Satyam, which led to a huge governance issue at the promoter as well as the inconsent and connivance with the auditors. It led to the total amount of financial irregularities of 7,500 crores, and in fact, it raised a big question, very big questions on the governance at the board level, the duties and responsibilities of the auditors, the independent directors, and the nominee directors, and the executive directors. So all these led to the enactment of various statutes by SEBI as well as by ministries like New Companies Act, and in fact listing agreement which was provided for the independence and the board governance norms were also refined further. Another case was of Amtech crisis, which happened just 1 year ago. In Amtech, in fact, though there was nothing going wrong from the misappropriation of fund side or the scam side, but it was more of a business prudency risk where, or it was a financial mismanagement basically, where Amtech was aggressive enough to grow, and for the growth, it was carrying out inorganic takeovers by using various funds, even short-term funds. So when short-term funds are used to purchase fixed assets, there has to be certain limits additionally. Otherwise, it creates a huge current liquidity issues. In addition, the forex risk was unchecked. In fact, it was borrowing on the ECB, external commercial borrowing. There were dollar borrowings, and those dollar borrowings were used to buy various assets locally. And in fact, during 2013-14, when dollars went up by around, rupee depreciated by around 20-25%, from 46 rupee to around 65 rupees, it led to the complete collapse of the dollar borrowing position which Amtech had. Ultimately, to pay for the one obligation, it was borrowing short term from the other obligation. led to the ultimate crisis where Amtech could not pay their funds borrowed from a mutual fund, which led to the trust deficit vis-a-vis the credit rating agencies, even to some extent vis-a-vis mutual fund fixed income portfolios, as well as of course vis-a-vis the corporate governance issues. In fact, with the credit rating agencies, the biggest challenge is that there is very thin line between the solvency risk and the liquidity risk. And hence, credit rating agency always face this challenge. At the same time, in fact, the trust deficit which was there vis-a-vis the governance issue, financial liquidity issue, or financial liquidity management, or vis-a-vis how the mutual fund investments were made. SEBI came up with the new regulations also to have more stringent regulations to take care of the company concentration risk and the industry concentration risk and the issuer-wise concentration risk. These 5-6 scandals plus a few scandals of 90s and early 2000s ultimately led to first enactment of certain provisions in New Companies Act. Of course, New Companies Act was about to come. There were various trials of the Companies Bill which were happening since 1995, 98, 93, 2003. But ultimately, Companies Act 2013 came up with the new provisions which were providing for a lot of guidance in relation to independence of director. Definition of independent director was introduced. Then it has the provisions of the whistleblower mechanism. It has the definition of fraud. The fraud's definition was introduced in section 447. Whistleblower related provisions, section 177 subsection 10 was saying about it. Independence of independent directors were separately categorized against nominee directors. There were separate provisions for the responsibilities and duties and obligation of independent directors, as well as defense by independent directors. The definition of officer in default was also revamped to include the CFOs, chief financial officers, company secretaries also within its ambit. Even the independent directors also now can be the officer in default if he does not object to any violation happening or anything which is prejudicial to the company, and knowingly this he does not object. The entity level control and was introduced, like New Companies Act, along with the various rules specifies that statutory auditors have to comment on the internal entity level controls. Chartered accountant guidelines on this says that okay, for statutory auditors to comment on the internal finance control, they have to go into deep to see whether there are entity level controls throughout the organization. Basically, having an internal operational risk management system with the list of the risk register, and risk assessment. In fact, this ultimately led to the emphasis of risk management into trading and manufacturing companies also. In fact, if you see in 80s and 90s, the emphasis of the risk management, capital adequacy ratio, all these were more for the financial services and sector entities. But advent of this Companies Act definitely led to the serious thought by all the corporates to have an internal risk management system and to have the list of the risks to identify the uncontrolled risk and to ensure that all high risk items are very well in control. This further led to, as I am saying, that further emphasis on operational compliance and reputational risk. To start with, before I take you through the list, let me first tell about reputational risk. In fact, it was just probably added to the slide. Reputation risk management is one of the area came up in last 7-8 years after various scandals. Now all the banks have a separate department section of reputation risk management. The focus area of that department is to really have a machinery which looks after media reports to check how many positive news versus negative news are there, plus the response mechanism in case there is a serious negative news only in the media, serious wrong publicity is coming in the media, to really have a media response team, media response machinery set up. Thirdly, to have access, media access controls by any of the employees at the time. Fourth, to really for the banks especially to check whether there are duplicate websites are coming or duplicate websites are coming by hackers, because there are always hackers trying to make duplicate websites of various private sector, public sector banks to really get information about the banking clients and data. So really to have a check on those sites and disable those hacking exercises by the hackers. To online fraud and e-fraud, online fraud is another area which reputation risk management system checks along with the help of IT team. Online fraud and this duplicate web are again the risk element for the e-tailers basically, or the like Flipkart and all those. They are also focusing very heavily on any kind of online payment frauds, or in case of duplicate websites coming in, so that the parallel duplicate payment channels are created to just get the customer data or the customer money. Coming to the list, like SOX certification, which came basically for the US listed companies after 2001 scam. SOX certification came in 2002, and in fact the idea was that okay, there should be a declaration by the CFO to the board of directors that all its systems and processes are well and working, and for this CFO may get back-to-back departments certifications. And along with, of course, there was a responsibility of regular review and the process, documented process, as to the extent we can rely on back-to-back certifications. KYC anti-money laundering cannot be ignored. In last 7, 8, 10 years, this has been a focus area of all the regulators globally. India Prevention of Money Laundering Act was introduced and thereafter amended as well. SEBI, RBI together are trying to work on various uniform KYC system by coming out with infrastructure regulation relating to uniform KYC or a CBL-based data, centralized database. It just came up very recently on the common KYC, for where banks plus SEBI registered entities together can have the common database at a central place. Risk registers, risk assessment are now very much known across the corporates. 10 years ago, hardly any corporate was aware as to what is the risk register, what is the risk assessment. Now it's a very well-known term thanks to the Companies Act and the entity level control related regulations. Whistleblowers policy has to be on the website of the company. Information about the whistleblower policy as per the Companies Act section 177. Then coming the liability insurance is another area. Of course, this was there not in 90s, but of course in mid 2000s this came up very heavily after so many scandals. Plus, there are certain businesses which have inherent risk of the third-party liabilities coming in. For example, pharmaceutical industry, research and development going on, clinical trials going on. There are always risk of the side effects of clinical trials and leading to the huge class litigations or huge litigations on the promoters and directors of those companies. Many such examples may lead to the outsourcing business, where outsourcing entities carry out various processes where there is a huge turnover of employees, and the employees leaving may lead to the various frauds. For example, registrars and transfer agents at those registrars and transfer agents, the employees can see the signatures of their shareholder clients and the folio numbers and the investors, and those can be easily forged for further fraudulent act, which may lead to the liabilities. So in fact, plus with the complexity is increasing, definitely the E&O policy, professional indemnity policy, fidelity insurance, fraud insurance policies are prevalent. If you go to insurance companies, general insurance companies, most of the general insurance companies in India also have various products to take care of the liability insurances. Of course, those are case by case and customized because each business is different, each client is different. Disaster recovery and business continuity has increased, has a very high focus area because of a huge banking network, ATM network, huge retail database of the mutual funds also, plus increased automation, which may lead to the which may lead to the failure of the system. Even if there is no disaster physically, even if there is no flood, no riots, but IT based, technically there can be snack for 3-4 days continuous. So disaster recovery business continuity plan has to be there by all the corporates now. Fraud prevention policies are prevalent across the organizations, which basically relates to which most of them have the focus areas like job rotation and compulsory leave during the year. Insider trading regulation after Rajaratnam case and certain other cases also, in fact, which led to the further complexity in relation to the banks where they have many directors on the list, various listed companies. So when nominee directors are assumed to have inside information because they are on the board, so how these insider trading regulations can work? In fact, insider trading regulation has increased its network and it can even trap the employees who left the organization 6 months ago. Anti-bribery regulation is another focus area of globally, especially like in India, we have a Prevention of Corruption Act. Globally, also US FCP Act, the UK Bribery Act. These enactments led to the increased focus area on anti-bribery regulations. Whenever there are global clients reviewing and carrying out due diligence for any Indian companies or any Indian sell-side entity, they definitely will always have a clause on their questionnaire on the anti-bribery policy and anti-bribery practices, gifts policy, gift practices. Outsourcing risk and outsourcing guidelines is another area because of the increased outsourcing functionalities. SEBI and RBI both came up with outsourcing related guidelines. Even IRDA for insurance companies also had come up. Another area within the same slide, a few more areas like ESG risk, environment, social and governance related risk focus on environment risk has increased recently. Focus on social risk and governance risk as well. Governance risk, as I explained in the previous slides, environment risk has been a very huge focus area recently, and on social, basically, for example, within India, now the focus has increased on women's safety, where even the risk management policies and practices include having a small thing, small things, but very relevant things. For example, having CCTV cameras everywhere, flexible hours, late sitting by women, prevention of sexual harassment in the workplace. These are another areas which have gained importance recently. Coming to the fiduciary businesses like mutual funds, insurances, PMS, and advisory businesses, they all also carry the liquidity risk, interest rate, inflation risk, and their model risk and plus systemic risk as well. Model risk in the sense that their internal processes, internal models based on which they do valuations, decision making. Those models may go wrong or may not work at the right moment. It may give a wrong decision. Within the fiduciary capacity, within the fiduciary businesses like SEBI and IRDA, plus of course Reserve Bank also came up with a more stringent disclosure norms, disclosure relating to like commission paid to brokers, distributors, and expense ratios as well. Disclosures relating to performances of the various schemes, similar schemes, or schemes managed by the same fund managers. Plus, there are now stringent norms leading to cut-off timing for investors to invest. Stringent norms about the ULIP for the ULIP products and relating to the recording of the trading decisions and voice recording, no mobile usage at the dealing rooms. ULIPs product, 3-year ULIPs product has been dismantled. Basically, what has been happening in mutual fund and insurance entities like insurances were selling ULIPs, which was having a mutual fund flavor, while mutual funds were selling schemes with the supplementary insurances, complementary insurances. So both were targeting the same audiences in different ways. Online limit monitoring was also another focus area of the recent changes. Regulations relating to PMS were introduced in late 90s, which has increased focus after the increase in PMS businesses. The distributors and advisors community, which was not under any regulation till recently, now are covered under the investment advisors regulation. This is an effort by the regulators to crack on the mis-selling practices. The regulations now prescribe detailed guidelines relating to client profiling and suitability. It is necessary for any wealth manager or the advisor to do client profiling and suitability, which is another area from the angle to work on mis-selling practices and to have adequate documentation of client due diligences before advising them any product. This is again came up with the fraud which happened with one of the wealth advisors around 2-3 years ago, where they did not have the proper information about the clients, and advisors were just going on rampantly to sell certain structured products. SEBI came up with the AIF regulation to really bridge the gap between private equity business and the mutual fund business. Private equity business had its own issues of non-transparency and risk-related issues, and because it was less transparent, SEBI tried to bridge that gap. That okay, let private equity also have a compliance officer or risk management functions, and let it also have a various stringent norms relating to disclosures. Stringent norms for credit concentration, credit risk also introduced, as I informed you, which is basically coming out of the learning from Lehman crisis and recent Amtech case and real estate exposures in India also in 2008. And in fact, that's the end of my presentation.
What's the difference between risk and uncertainty?
Yeah, in fact, I had shown in one of the slides earlier. Like basically, of course, to start with, I mean, everything is uncertain. Now it is upon us to really trying to objectively identify the probability of certain uncertainty and working around the calculation of risk around it. So the risk is a part of uncertainty. Risk is basically uncertainty, but it's a calculated uncertainty. There are further uncertainties which cannot be calculated, which are unknown basically. Uncertainty is basically like unknowing, not knowing what we don't know, which is much more riskier. Risk is knowing what we don't know and knowing what calculated risk I am taking. So definitely, in being in the risk circle is still safer than being in uncertain circle.
Okay, so we have another question from Rohini. She asks, what is the risk associated with mutual funds and the exchange traded funds for investors?
Okay, risk with a direct mutual fund is basically directly investing in the fund, where fund will declare its end of day NAV. Funds are managed, end of day NAV is declared. Mutual fund units are allotted based on end of day NAV on the day you have invested. ETF, exchange traded fund, is again like it's repackaged. Investors can't go to the office of the mutual fund to give their application, but they can directly buy from the market. Now, because it is closed-ended, means you cannot go to the office for redemption or for this thing, for investing. Its portfolios are based on certain expectation of NAV, and based on those expectation of NAV, in the equities market, those district prices are thrown out by the bids and asks. So bid and ask or traded prices over there are basically expected NAV of the mutual fund portfolio. So you can directly go to ETF, purchase over there and sell over there. The benefit of ETF is that you need not wait for end of the NAV. For example, if the markets collapsed in the morning and further collapsed at 1 p.m., you can go to the stock exchange terminal and buy at 1 p.m. You need not wait to go to the mutual fund office, because in mutual fund office you will get an NAV of end of day, and who knows that by the end of day markets may recover. So you may get a benefit of intraday timing on exchange traded. Secondly, what happens in a mutual fund, because there is no fund flow coming and going out from investor, the cash is managed very well, and whatever corpus is there, that can be invested in a more beneficial and more profitable manner. Because of this, the expenses like brokerage expenses or any kind of churning expenses, purchase and sale of securities expenses are saved. These savings ultimately led to increase in expected NAVs.
So we have another question from Sanjay. He asks, what part of risk management should be known as a retail investor?
What part of risk management should be known as a retail investor? As a retail investor, the idea is that in fact you should have at least basic market risk management is one area definitely he should know, and secondly, to some extent, credit risk related areas. Market risk related areas basically because you are investing in certain markets, maybe fixed income market, currency market, commodity market, or equities market, or wherever. You should have basic ideas to how can I manage risk, what risk I am taking by investing, and whether I have enough cushion to take care of that risk. And so this is definitely of utmost important. Second important is the liquidity risk management, for example, plus of course knowledge of the products. For example, in mutual funds, liquid funds, or the fixed income funds or equity funds, what are the risks and rewards of each of the product, and what is your back-end liquidity requirement, whether you need funds in 3 months, 6 months, or 3 years, or 6 months. Second area you must be aware of is to some extent the KYC related operational risk issues, where it may happen that in your different investment you may have different joint names, your KYC data may not be there in certain centralized database. So on those things you should be very much clear. Third aspect on the credit risk side, where of course you may not have the capital adequacy type of risk management, but you should have basic idea about what are the credit rating agencies and what are the meaning of AAA, AA, single A ratings, and accordingly whatever yield you are getting on your debentures are in line with your expectations. Fourthly, other aspect which you should be aware of to some extent about again derivatives. Derivatives is again a part of the market risk management, where you should have some idea about how for example, what is the open interest, what is the call put ratios. So just to get a feel as to where the market may go. It's not that knowing these risks will make you to take corrective decisions always, but definitely it is an additional light in the dark for you to help out in making corrective decisions. Actually, I'm unable to get an idea as to what Jasmine means by our risk profile, whether it's about a personal risk profile or risk profile of the country as India or in financial markets. But let me try to give some personal risk profile. So now the thing is, each individual has a different risk profile and liquidity requirement. A lot depend upon my back-end liquidity requirement, which is a function of my family background and the expected liquidity and expected obligations. For example, someone may need money for let's say marriage expenses, buying a house, or then medical needs of the parents or whatever. So liquidity requirement and the time length of the liquidity requirement, that is one of the biggest factor to determine the investment profile. For example, if the liquidity requirement is near, we should invest in the near term liquid funds or short term bank deposits. Liquid funds are better choice because those are more tax efficient. And if there is no liquid requirement for next 10 years or 5 years to come or 3-4 years to come, definitely one can take a huge risk and invest for 5 to 10 years. The young, secondly, depend upon the age as well. Like if the younger, at the middle age and at the young age, definitely investor can go more towards the risky assets because they can block their funds for longer time. Longer time is enough time to come out of the market crashes as well as to earn the compounding effect of the market, compounding effect of the returns. But if if a person is getting older, let's say above 45, above 50, above 60, definitely his investment should have more focus area towards the regular income, which may be by way of dividend from equity mutual funds, or maybe by way of fixed income investments or debentures where interest income, or rental income from real estate. So it's all depend upon individual background and risk tolerance.